CGTN, China Global Television Network.
A multi-currency world appears imminent, and the dominance of the US dollar as the global currency of choice may be coming to an end. New developments in the global economic landscape point to this inevitability. This shift has been notable in the BRICS group of countries, where trade using their own currencies has commenced. So, is the dollar in danger of losing its prestigious status? And why do some countries want to break away? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. To discuss this issue, let's bring in our panel of experts. In Beijing, Dr. John Gong, Professor of Economics, University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. And joining us from San Francisco, Ryan Patel, Global Business Executive and Senior Fellow, Drucker School of Management, Claremont Graduate University. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to you both. Let me start off with you, Dr. Gong. The US dollar has long been the dominant currency in international trade. However, many countries are looking for alternatives to reduce the dependence on the US dollar. Why are countries beginning to opt out of using the US dollar?
Well, I think the staying away from dollar really started a few years ago when the United States started to impose sanctions on a couple of countries, starting with Iran, for example. So for some time, China's trade with Iran has to be using currencies other than US dollar. And more recently, of course, the sanctions imposed on Russia. And certainly, Russia shut away from the SWIFT system, and about $200 billion of trade between Moscow and Beijing will have to be settled by a currency that is other than US dollar. Now, on top of this, we see more and more signs of other countries, especially resource exporting countries like Saudi Arabia, Brazil, gradually also shifting away to some extent, actually, from US dollar for trade with China and other countries. So I think, there are various reasons for that. And I think the fundamental reasons, again, is that, U.S. weight in the total global trade is actually waning. I think that's probably the more fundamental reason other than other things. And of course, Washington's own actions also are propelling many countries to start to stay away from the dollar. Things like sanctions, things like confiscating assets, things like, I think we would describe it as weaponizing the U.S. dollar. So these things certainly also contribute to the winning role of the U.S. dollar in international trade.
Ryan, I want to hear your view here. What's your reaction?
The dollar, I don't think the dollar is going anywhere, but as Professor said, the way that the dollar was looked at obviously is going to be different moving forward. I think one main thing why it is too is the way that technology, the blockchain technology going forward, how it's establishing cross-border financial linkages. That has been something that will support and help regional countries. Like we see it in the Monetary Authority of Singapore with their Project Guardian, which they're trying to do a test trial last year in November about kind of creating a live transaction cross-country and tokenizing the Singaporean dollar and the Japanese yen. So when you think about some of these items and you think about how it then compares to the US dollar, I don't think the way we look at currency as of 10 years ago to now will change. I think the dollar still will be important to the world. But to your point, will it be what it used to be? I don't think so. Just because when you think about how local countries want to use their own currency, and really now there's more of a safer place. Before it was risk driven of using certain currencies, but when you can create some trust and credibility in local currencies, I think many governments will look to that way to do that for their citizens.
So, Dr. Gong, I want to get your view here. Is the dollar going to remain as it is? Is this the end of it, or not much is going to change, according to Ryan?
No, but that I totally agree with Ryan. Dollar is going nowhere. I mean, it's not going to go away. It's still going to be very dominant. But I guess the point is that it's not going to be as dominant as it used to be. And we're gradually entering into an era where there are multi-currencies being used. Although the other currencies' weights in international investment, and in trade, for example, are still very small. I think a good measure is to look at the the weights in the special drawing rights with the IMF, for example. I mean, that's a fairly accurate and also quite objective measure of how important different currencies are. They have a special formula to come up with their weights, and in that, in the special drawing right, United States dollar is still very dominant. I think it's close to 50%. I think, if I remember this correctly, in the European Union's euro is about 20-some%, and I think China is a little bit short of 15%. And then you have British pounds and Japanese yen. That's a fairly good picture of how important these currencies are in today's world right now, I think.
Right. So I want to get this from both of you. And Ryan, we heard earlier on from Dr. Gong, and he talked about the various reasons that countries are moving away from the U.S. dollar. What, in your view, do you see as the shared grievances among countries that want to break away from the dollar?
Well, I think the thing that we see, or I think in anything, when you put any business leader or any looking at currency, it's about risk. Right? I mean, at the end of the day, when you think about how people use different currencies and the way that, even with the way that, other types of currencies being used, they always talk about risk. So I think if someone uses and goes away from the dollar, it's all going to be to their benefit. I think there has been some instability of what you've seen with the Fed, Federal Reserve in the U.S. with hiking interest rates and, being probably not so clear a couple of years ago on what their strategy was in attacking inflation. And so I think you did see some other countries kind of choose to not to want to be a part of that or want to have some stability. So I think the main, for me, when I look at it, when we talk about the U.S. dollar, why many countries would move away is obviously it's because of, for them, not being able to pinpoint what the stability looks like moving forward, because in any main currency, you want stability. And so if there's some resistance or some kind of variance between the currency trading between a local currency or where they think it is, I think that's what's been a lot of the moves over the last couple of years to that degree.
So, Dr. Gong, I want to go back to the number of countries that have started moving away gradually, because in recent months, Brazil, Argentina have discussed the creation of a common currency. China and Brazil will trade in national currencies. The UAE and India are in talks to use rupees. Saudi Arabia has said that it is open to trading in currencies besides the US dollar. Most of these deals are bilateral. How exactly is it going to work, and what do you see as the benefits?
Well, it has to start from somewhere, and I think the easiest thing to start from is indeed these bilateral, swap agreements. What it means is that, for example, take the example of China and Brazil. What it means is that, China authorizes the establishment, and also Brazilian government also authorizes the establishment of a local currency, RMB, that's China's currency, clearinghouse in Brazil. I would guess maybe Bank of China's branch in Brazil or some other bank in Brazil. And what it does essentially is to serve as an offshore market, offshore RMB market, such that trade and also investment, also personal expenses by Chinese tourists in Brazil, for example, can be settled in RMB. And there's essentially a local currency market for RMB in these countries. And I think this is a sort of a gradual phased approach. It's probably more of a realistic and practical solution. After all, I guess a lot of people don't even know that China's currency, RMB, is still very much a capital controlled currency. I mean, you go to the bank here in China, asking to exchange for $2,000, that's not going to be a problem. If you're asking for change of $20 million, that's going to be a problem. So, I think in this way, essentially established a sort of more of an insulated overseas market, offshore market for RMB, with more RMB being used overseas. Probably someday, hopefully not so far away, we're going to see the convergence of both markets when capital control here in China can be totally opening up.
So, Ryan, if we're talking about a gradual phase approach, particularly when it comes to bilateral trade deals, and even though it is still early days, how do you think this will work on a multilateral level transaction?
No, that's a great point. I think you got to take baby steps when we see it, but I got one word for you: is technology. Right? When I think of what's going on in the fintech side, when you think about startups, you think about companies putting a lot of money to solve this problem, to solve the settlement issue between payments and services and transferring of goods. Before, it was really high percentage would be taken away in transactions when you give foreign exchange rates. Now, because of technology and new startups coming in, they're starting to slow and close that gap. And when you start closing that gap when it comes to that fee, you can start doing these things that are more than just one-to-one. You can change currencies across different currencies easier than before. And I see that. I see that access is going to happen to consumers, to businesses. And I think more over time, it's going to be a convenience, and there's going to be an ability for then companies and businesses and countries and even citizens to choose where they want to have it. Because if you think about it, 10 years ago, I don't think we have that much choice of where you want to keep your currency if you want to change it. It was a difficult process. And I think that process is going to change moving forward.
Dr. Gong, what's your reaction? Should the U.S. be concerned here?
Washington is absolutely very concerned about it. I think the prospect of U.S. dollar losing its dominance in the world is going to make a lot of politicians in Washington sleepless. The reason is very simple. United States currency is being used everywhere. While at the same time, United States maintains a huge, gigantic trade deficit with many countries. Couple of $100 billion a year, and for that, if think about the scenario where the United States has to maintain a foreign exchange reserve to support that trade deficit, this is something unimaginable. So right now, it can keep up with that picture by just printing money. I think it's not just the RMB or other currencies. I think the very first day that euro was formed was something very concerned to Washington. I think I can point out to a couple of actions by the United States to try to curtail the use of the euro in the past. Now we're starting to see more and more other currencies, notably China's RMB, becoming more and more important in international business. So I think this is a scenario that's certainly being very worrisome to a lot of politicians in Washington.
Right. Ryan, I want to look at it from a bit of a geopolitical front here, because it is early days, but analysts are arguing that the more the U.S. adopts hegemonic means to achieve its purposes, and we heard that from Dr. Gong at the beginning, the more eager the international community will be to get rid of the excessive reliance on the dollar. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think it's just in general I think in any situation, when you have all your, the common thing is if you all your eggs in one basket, you want to be able to diversify. And if we've learned anything in the last couple of years, especially with COVID, you want to diversify your risk, so you have less risk, and you want to diversify kind of your holdings. And we're seeing that in the banking industry as well. You don't want to be able to put all your money in one place. So I think I can see the ability for diversifying that aspect. I think that there is some worry about what currency is going to be very stable, and I think we're in early days, not so much just also in, like I mentioned, in what the US dollar is, but the way we use and spend and interact money. To be truthful, this is the second part of the conversation. The way we interact in the financial market, from markets to buying stock, is very different in the going forward, and even I can't predict on what that's going to look like and how that's going to change. And I think that's part of also, when you think about the excitement piece, you would hopefully also mean that, it brings some stability. I use that word because the last thing you want to do with no matter what currency you use, that it is worthless versus it actually being real value.
Dr. Gong, do you see more countries, turning away from the dollar, using their national currencies? I mean, how exactly do you see the U.S. having used its dollar hegemony?
Yeah, I'm starting to see more and more sort of regional deals, multilateral deals. This is a new development. In addition to bilateral agreements, these kind of swap agreements, we're starting to see more and more regional multilateral forums talking about this. And I think this is a very important new development, particularly as related to the development at the BRICS, for example. If we look at the BRICS countries, the BRIC plus Saudi, I would say, these are all extremely important natural resource exporting countries, right? You're talking about Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, India. these are huge economies, emerging market economies. And when they talk about jointly develop another alternative mechanism for trade using alternative currencies, this is a bombshell for Washington. And I think I can imagine Washington would do everything possible to try to prevent that from happening. But it's a very difficult step, by the way. I think when we talk about that, I'm not sure we're talking about RMB or BRICS. It could be some other currency. India has its own idea. Saudi probably has its own idea as well. So it's something pretty easy to start with, but I would imagine quite difficult to move forward. We have to see what in concrete terms what are coming out of the next round of BRICS finance minister meetings, and whether they have a really detailed plan for moving things forward. But I would imagine there's a lot of haggling going on at these meetings.
All right, gentlemen, do stay with us, because on that note, we're going to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll examine what a multi-currency world would look like and what this means for Africa. Do stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's now continue with our discussion. Still with me are in Beijing, Dr. John Gong, Professor of Economics, University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. In San Francisco, Ryan Patel, Global Business Executive and Senior Fellow, Drucker School of Management, Claremont Graduate University. And joining me from Johannesburg, John Foster Pedley, Dean and Director, Henley Business School, Africa. John, if I may start off with you, because in exchange for the dollar, the currencies of many African countries are rather quite weak. When we talk about a multi-currency level here, multi-currency trade with countries trading using their national currencies, how has this impacted trade by African countries in international markets?
Well, I think African countries are fundamentally pragmatic. The importance for them is to get trade done with whoever they can do, without too many transaction costs, without too many inhibitions, and also free of some sense of some political control. The history of Africa is that there's massive domination by different power blocks, and Africans are very skeptical now about people bearing gifts in terms of free aid, etc. So what we need to have is a much broader set of currencies to trade in, or, if you're going to stick with the dollar, a very, very flexible dollar that's going to be able to be engaged with across the world. And of course, that isn't going to be attractive to China, to Russia, to other places who want to have more trade, more influence in their own currencies, and the ability to be faster and more agile. So I think you've got an open scenario in Africa now, a land of opportunity, where those who come with good deals, good currency mixes, and allow people in those countries to do trade easily, and that's the particular secret, easy trade, you're going to see the African countries going towards them rather agnostically of historic political influence.
But John, what are the potential opportunities and risks here for a multi-currency world for Africa?
Well, I think the opportunities are, it gives you flexibility, it gives you the possibilities of having quicker trade, it gives you a freedom from some of the old power blocks and the old power influences that might have dominated Africa in the past. The risks are, of course, more volatility, more uncertainty, being caught up in the wrong basket of currencies, if you like. So it comes with a need for increased management and increased skills in managing across borders with the money. So, of course, there are many attractions, but I have to say there are many risks, and I don't want to underestimate those risks, because if we do, we will be selling people the opportunity of doing multicultural business very easily, whereas in fact, what we need to do is give people the skills, the training, the background, and the systems, and the institutions that are going to allow them to trade more flexibly. And that is what Africa needs. It needs help with education, needs help with institutions, it needs help with building their prosperity, and it needs to be move away from these extractive forms of trade that you could argue that single currency denomination trade facilitates. We don't want to replace it with another type. So my answer is that if you want to do good business with Africa, international business with Africa, then help people learn how to use these currencies. And don't think they're necessarily easy to slip into.
Dr. Gong, this is an interesting implication here because China is now Africa's leading trade partner. What is the implication of all of this for Africa? How will African countries benefit from the increased use of alternative currencies for trading or investment?
There are some countries in the world right now that are heavily reliant upon the United States dollar. That are in big trouble right now. Countries like Sri Lanka, Turkey, these are examples of taking the consequences of the Feds in the United States raising interest rate. What it means is that dollars becoming more expensive, the worsening of the balance of payments in these countries. There's massive capital exodus from these countries back to the United States, and the local currency is depreciating pretty heavily. There's a saying, said by somebody in the Treasury Department some time ago that it is our money and that's your problem, right? So I think at least by offering another alternative, that is RMB, I think many African countries are at least immune from this type of difficulties as a result of the tightening of interest rates in Washington. I think there's a lesson learned here that on one hand, moving away from these one single currency is take some risk, as John has alluded to earlier. But on the other hand, I think it also lessens the over-reliance upon a single currency, which can be subject to this kind of financial risks as a result of interest rate rises in the United States.
Ryan, that whole question of over-reliance and perhaps Africa could be immune to some of the difficulties when it, of global trade. But let's talk about the ways in which this multi-currency dispensation can address some of the unfairness. Could it address some of the unfairness and inequalities that exist in the global financial system as currently constituted?
Well, that's a great question. I think there's a multitude of steps that has to be able to do that. And, again, another thing I would say would be technology, right? The swiftness, the easiness, the convenience to be able to do that it has to occur should it want to be successful to do that. But then you ask the question, so is that being able to pinpoint and make it easy for people to trade and have that ability to be worth something, is that a currency occurring? Is that something that occurs in what currency does it do that? Is it a digital asset, right? So the way we look at that again will be very different when you think about transferring between different bank accounts. And so to be successful, it has to do this, these other things of that trust, that ability that has to occur. It cannot just be, hey, we got all these, we have alternatives, but they're not equally the same, right? You want to be able to have that trust in that aspect of that value, so what you're getting yourself into, that there isn't that much of a risk. I think it goes back to that question of convenience and being able to do that.
So, John, what sort of measures, when we talk about the convenience, what sort of measures do you see African countries taking, or can African countries take to make the most of this new development and reduce their over-reliance on the US dollar?
Well, I think there's an awful lot of training and development to be done. I mean, while we can talk about theory and what we can do in institutions, the big challenge is always talent in Africa, talent capability. We have an education deficit in Africa. We have very smart people. And if you want to get people to engage in this, then help with education, help with development. I know that's not the economic argument nor the currency argument, but that is the real thing we need to do to capacitate people in Africa to do this. Because what we need to do is build prosperity in Africa, not just another alternative, very high Gini coefficient, another elite. And I think that's the big thing. So if you come into Africa with those mentalities, you're going to get a warm welcome and people will engage with this. Also, I think you've got to accept currencies more readily. Sure, there's volatility in Iran, there's volatility in Brazilian currencies, etc. But you need to have those currencies more readily traded, more available to you. So that's really important as well. You've also got to really engage in anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism activities around finance. South Africa has just been grey listed by the TATF. for other. And that grey listing is a significant burden on companies trading within South Africa. Help with that. Be very clear on your legislation and on your clarity of your quality assurance around anti-money laundering. Now, this isn't always attractive to people who want to come into Africa and build businesses and going around the regulation. But that is not a long-term and sustainable position for Africa. And I want to advocate for Africa now with multinational, with international organizations and countries that you do come into Africa with a development mentality, not an extractive mentality. I have to say that is the most important thing that you can do if you want to get traction in Africa.
All right, so I want to get your final comments as we wind down the program. And John Foster, let me start off with you here. How do you see a multi-currency world and a multipolar world developing? Do you think it is necessary to introduce an alternative to the US dollar as a standard currency?
I think there's an inevitability. Obviously, if you talk to China and the Chinese government, they would like to see yuan take over that role or be a multiple currency. Other countries in Asia would like to see their currencies take hold. So I think what you're seeing is a changing in power dynamics internationally. I'm not going to advocate for one or the other. I'm just saying the natural process of evolution will see more flexible use of currencies, more resourceful, more imaginative use of currencies, more options, more flexibilities, more freedom of trade emerging through financial instruments and financial changes. I think that's an inevitability, but it's a bit like AI. It's not that you will be replaced by AI. Your job will be replaced by somebody who knows how to use AI. So when it comes to the financial markets and instruments as well, what will happen is those people who know how to use these financial instruments, know how to use them for development, will be the people who will be in the pole and leading position in the future. If you're looking for global domination in one way or the other, that's not an honorable target. If you're looking for developing people internationally and helping people grow their potential, that is an honorable target, and that's what we should aim for.
Dr. Gong, how do you see a multi-currency world and a multipolar world developing?
Well, we are seeing it's developing. It's a small step right now. Should I say it's a small step by a few countries? Should I say that it's a giant leap for mankind? It's something unstoppable in my view. And I think it's going to gradually moving towards that direction. But let's also be very realistic here that US dollar is still going to play a very dominant role for a long, long time.
Ryan, you have the final word.
Well, if I had to say anything, we're in it together, and I would hope that the global financial system and currency, we need each other to be able to have that trade to make societies better and countries together. So I would hope that naturally in the future that there is going to be more work together, and maybe you can call me I'm too hopeful, but I'm hoping that institutions and governments and countries come together to be able to prop that stability.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for a very insightful discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to my panel of experts. In Johannesburg, John Foster Pedley, Dean and Director, Henley Business School, Africa. In Beijing, Dr. John Gong, Professor of Economics, University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. And in San Francisco, Ryan Patel, Global Business Executive and Senior Fellow, Drucker School of Management, Claremont Graduate University. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and Twitter, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.